So good morning, David. Good to see you again. We are recording some author talk shorts today, and we're very excited to have Dr. Schein back again. And Amy, if you'll make sure this recording goes live on Facebook on Friday, I want to announce that Dr. Schein, David Schein, will be our guest on Author Talk this Monday, which will be what's the date on Monday? 30th, March 30th. So Monday, March 30th, our guest will be Dr. David Schein, and we'll talk about a lot of stuff going on. We'll have more time then, and also be talking about his book, The Decline of America, 100 Years of Leadership Failures. So that's what we're going to talk about for this call. David, is your book, Decline of America. And you've looked at how many presidents?
Well, we covered 17 presidents in the book. We covered Wilson through Obama, which interestingly, given that there are supposedly more Democrats than Republicans in the United States, it's 8 Democrats and 9 Republicans. And actually, if you add Trump, that's 8 Democrats and 10 Republicans over the last roughly 110 years. The book, we used a round number of 100, although the book actually covers 104 years, and we're now up in a window for where I've been asked to present over 108 years roughly. But that was our target, was to talk about kind of the modern era, which began with Wilson and World War I.
And that was World War I. I remember that the World War was going on when he was president. And I mentioned to you at another time that we were watching some history program documentary, and it was about Woodrow Wilson, or at least one part of it was. And you find out things about people that you didn't know when you see a documentary on them. So I didn't know his wife had died, and while he was still president, and several other things. But I remembered as I'm watching it that, wow, he was the first one in the book. So what had you start with Woodrow Wilson?
So the situation with Woodrow Wilson is that he's largely been overblown by the press and by so-called historians and people who pretend to be historians. And Wilson was not a great guy. He reportedly, in modern history, was the president of Princeton University and was then ran for president. He actually wasn't president of Princeton University. He had been fired from that role. And so let's just start with that myth. But one of the things that brought his name to attention recently was the fact that at Princeton University, there is a Woodrow Wilson, Public Policy Institute. The black students said Wilson was an overt racist. His name shouldn't be associated with our university. Princeton reviewed that, decided not to change the name. I find that interesting, given that they fired Wilson as president, quite some time ago, roughly 100 years ago now, actually more than that, probably 110 years ago. So Wilson studiously tried to avoid the United States getting into World War I. And one of my overall criticisms of American presidents of the last 100 years is that they have acted poorly and have made bad management decisions driven by political interest. And one of my cures for that is to say that we absolutely, positively in the United States must go to a one-term president. 8 years is ridiculous. And what happens is that the president spends most of his first term running to get reelected to the second term, and then during the second term basically runs as a lame duck and looks for a place to put his presidential library. So Wilson was an interesting character. He had a long-term affair outside of his marriage, and this was well documented. And what was interesting is that his wife, number one, dies while he's in the White House. Roughly a year and a half later, and much courtship later, which has more recently been appointed, he apparently saw a woman at a function or something, and decided to pursue her. She was relatively recently widowed, and she played hard to get, and he sent many love letters to her and all this. And so he did eventually marry while he was in the White House. Interestingly, he did not marry his paramour. And as far as we know, continued to see the paramour, but married wife number two while he was in the White House. That may have explained why he suffered a stroke about a year before he left the White House. And reportedly, again, the press was not welcomed into the White House like they are today. Reportedly, Mrs. Wilson ran the government for the last year, but the United States basically bailed out England and France, I mean, totally bailed them out in World War I. And despite this, Wilson got almost no respect in his concept of League of Nations, which was basically a failure. In fact, the United States Congress never agreed for the United States to join the League of Nations. So he basically was a failed president. And people say, well, but how can you say he was a failed president if we won World War I? The answer is we won World War I over the blood and guts and terrible sacrifice of our fine American young soldiers. And Wilson had little or nothing to do with it other than to make it worse, because he allowed American shipping to be destroyed by German submarines and attack vessels for at least 2 years before he finally came up with the gumption to allow the United States to go in. 6 months after the United States entered World War I, we had conquered Germany. And I say we, the United States, had conquered Germany, because England and France were exhausted at this point because the United States had entered so late. So not an A plus there.
It was a tough war. Everything I've read about it, everything I've seen in documentaries and all the others, it was really World War I was really a tough war. So you start the book out with he's the first one, but what you did was actually grade each one of the presidents since then up into through Obama. So what criteria did you use? I mean, like what did you grade them on? Was it the same thing? You graded every one of them on the very same thing? Is that how that worked?
That is correct. And the idea of the grading was based on general leadership and management principles. It is a leadership book. It is not a history book. We use history to talk about leadership and management. So that was number one, is were you a good manager? Did you make things work better for the United States people? And then the second part was on ethics. And I'm very concerned about ethics. I think good businesses, good governments operate on ethical principles. And I did ethics a little differently. I did what I called public ethics and private ethics. And so private ethics, of course, in Wilson's case, he's out with his girlfriend, and he's a racist. And we know that for a fact. That's not optional. That's not for debate. But in addition, did he make the government operate in a racist manner? And the answer is he appointed people who supported his racist principles. So Wilson was not a great manager or leader. He was not particularly strong in his personal ethics, and he wasn't particularly good in his public ethics. So not a highly graded individual. Some people who have, kind of one, not the other, is Jimmy Carter. Best I can tell, Jimmy Carter's public and private ethics were very, very strong, maybe one of the strongest presidents within the last 108 years, but without much personal scandal. But he was an awful government leader, apparently a successful entrepreneur with his peanut farm. But in terms of the way he ran the United States government, he was one of the few one-term presidents, and he basically earned that one-term distinction. And was somebody who was faced with a crisis, and that was, of course, the invasion of the American embassy in Iran. And Carter, whether he handled it well or not is up for debate, but basically he was unsuccessful at resolving that. And so, that's a fair contrast. Somebody who faced no big challenges during his administration was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was, in my opinion, the luckiest of all of the presidents that I looked at, meaning that he faced no significant crisis during his 8 years in the White House. He came in on the heels of a good president, and that was George H.W. Bush. But what happened with George Bush is that the economy had hit a slide, and ironically, the economy was already statistically recovering from the 1992 droop before the election, but it wasn't really realized till afterwards. So Bill Clinton skated into office in a narrow election. There was a third-party candidate who sucked up enough votes to keep George Bush from being reelected. And then again in 1996, Clinton, who had many scandals, was able to get through the 96 election against a weak Republican challenger in Bob Dole. And then the scandals hit, the Monica Lewinsky scandal, the rape allegations hit after he had already been reelected. And of course, he survived an impeachment challenge. So it's kind of interesting to look at across the spectrum as to who would be best in terms of management and ethics.
So in one of our other conversations, we talked about who would be a good president today, or who would you like to see as president today during this coronavirus pandemic and all of that. And you said Truman, I believe. Was that your answer?
Yes. Harry Truman was a straight shooter, a basic, hardworking, down-to-earth guy, and I think that he would, those type of basic principles would work as well today as they did as the United States very successfully recovered from World War II and also operated the Marshall Plan, which was a phenomenal accomplishment to put a totally ruined Europe back on its feet. That was based on a historical observation. Supposedly, the reason that Hitler was able to rise to power in Germany was because the victors, basically England and France, had insisted on reparations from Germany. And they basically kept Germany broke, and with people broke and not having enough money and food and having an unsuccessful economy, it created circumstances for Hitler to organize the German people. Of course, he focused that anger, ridiculously on the Jewish people, but he also focused it on England and France, who, of course, were later brutally attacked by Hitler. But the idea of the Marshall Plan was, if people are put back on their feet and have successful economies, they're not going to come beat up on other neighbors and even the United States.
So all presidents, or most, and I never thought of Bill Clinton being lucky not to have had any major events go on during his presidency, but most presidents have faced some catastrophic event or potentially catastrophic. So right now we're dealing with the coronavirus. And we talked that Truman would be a good president to have right now. But of all of the things that happened, we had the Bay of Pigs, we've had World War II. All these events have happened since World War I. Which one of those do you think required the most out of the president, I guess?
Gosh, I'd say that's a tough call. I can tell you that probably the more defining event of the last 110 years would be World War I, World War II, and the decision that Truman made, not Roosevelt. Roosevelt had already died in the arms of his lover, not his wife, which is not reported very often. But yeah, Roosevelt was a piece of work, by the way. But Truman was the one who made the decision to drop the A-bomb. And of course, 2 were dropped. That decision remains controversial today. in my book, I don't come out one way or another and say whether it was a great decision or not. I believe that it finally convinced Japan that it was time to give up the ghost. And Japan was, even after the first A bomb, there was about a 4-day delay before the second one was dropped. Japan had an opportunity to say, oh my gosh, it's time to give it up. They didn't give it up until the second bomb was dropped. So unfortunately, the trade-off was 100,000 American deaths and untold deaths on the other side versus the two bombs that were set off. So that was probably some of the most significant decisions. George W. Bush obviously had one of the worst circumstances in the current lifetime of most people alive today, and that was, of course, 9/11. And 9/11, I was in Washington, D.C. I personally saw the smoke coming off the Pentagon and I was one of the first people to drive past the Pentagon several days later when they opened the highways that go past the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And I can tell you that that is a truly defining moment for the generation, the baby boomers and the people born after World War II. I think that's going to be considered the other defining event. And I think that George W. Bush did a pretty good job of dealing with that crisis. Obviously, his administration, consensus was not a great administration, didn't end well. And then unfortunately, we continued down the same sad path with the administration of Barack Obama, which he really did not do much other than create some negative things. He has the distinction of having the worst recovery from an economic recession in history. The United States has a very vibrant and flexible and enduring economy, and he was unable to master that. His passage of the Obamacare bill, which some people are still clinging to, frankly, I think has clearly been a failure. One of the issues that is talked about a lot is the pre-existing condition healthcare, and that's fraudulent. Basically, the reason it's fraudulent is the following. Health insurance companies are required to offer health insurance to everyone under Obamacare. But Obamacare designed Cadillac plans for everyone, which made health insurance across the country more expensive, not less expensive. It accomplished exactly the opposite of what was promoted. But also importantly is that a person with a pre-existing condition can buy insurance, but there was no cost limit. So what I'm told by people who are in their 50s and 60s and not yet eligible for Medicare is that they cannot afford health insurance because the cost of health insurance with significant deductibles would be $1,500 or $2,000 a month. So this concept, well, you can buy insurance even in pre-existing conditions without having a price cap on it or some type of a government mandated sharing mechanism, that really is not a true statement. So it's something that's been mentioned a lot. I do think that Trump has done reasonably well as a president. This is his crisis, if you will, and I wouldn't give him a perfect grade by any means, but a lot of people applaud his decision very early in the game to bar all traffic from China. And China, of course, is the origin of the virus. And I do think that Trump is listening to the fine people around him, like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the world's leading expert on epidemiology and these type of infections. So we've got good help. We're, I think, making reasonable decisions. I am a pretty big critic of the shelter-in-place orders. I don't think that because there are so many exceptions that they're necessarily that effective. I think social spacing, hand sanitation, sick people staying home or getting in for good medical care are far more effective solutions.
Well, thank you very much, David. This has been very informative. We now know more about your book and the different presidents and how they were graded. So thank you for that. The book is available. It's available on Amazon. So just look for The Decline of America by Dr. David Schein, and you can get it there. Also, David is available. We're in Houston. David is available to speak for various organizations, and he has done a lot of work with different civic groups. He is a professor at the University of St. Thomas here in Houston. So he has a lot of topics. If you're interested in him coming to speak to your networking group, to your civic group, or to your organization, feel free to get in touch with him or with me. We'd love to introduce him to you. He could speak now through Zoom or other video conferencing resources, and he'll be available to come in person once we are past this pandemic that we're experiencing right now. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, David, for being here. Elena and Amy, thanks for being here, and Rachel. And so we will see you again next time for another Author Talk Short.
Thank you, Sandy.